Welcome back to our first session, our first theme, our first lecture here on what human resource management is all about. And we're continuing here into sessions. Human resource strategy in action within the context of understanding the role of human resource management. Just a reminder of all the learning outcomes. Again, we're unpacking in quite a lot of detail the role of management of human resources, and we're also beginning to look at the approaches in terms of strategy. Just a reminder, so this is lecture 1 or theme 1. I've highlighted it again. We've got 5 themes or 5 lectures, and we have 10 sessions of around 20 minutes in each one of these themes. So we're on session 7 now, so we're almost getting to the end of lecture 1, at which point we'll move on to the next theme or to the next lecture. Again, the key learning outcome for this particular session, we're still unpacking the role and the purpose of strategic human resource management, and we're going to go into this again. Unpacking the various actions. So this is how we finished session 6. You did your multiple choice questions. You know that you can anticipate these at the end of every single session just to test your knowledge, 10 to 15 of these. And so here we have covered quite a few. We've looked at AMO. This will pop up again here in session 7. We've covered this in session 5, thinking about the ability, the motivation, and the organization. We also looked at the contingency approach in session 5. In session 4 already, we were unpacking the resource-based view. In the previous session, we looked at Porter's, the competitive advantage. And so in this particular session, we're going to be looking at FIFA's high commitment HR practice. We're going to look at that one in a little bit more detail, the Michigan model in a little bit more detail, the life cycle model or product life cycle, and the variation on contingency, looking at the configuration approaches. So these are going to be our 4 specific models that we're going to look at in terms of what this looks like in strategy, in action. Session 6, we did finish off suggesting, why don't you look at the case study in chapter 3 around South Africa and the motor industry. We're going to actually unpack that in a little bit more detail and use some of those reflective questions to think about human resource management strategies in action. Okay, so that gives you a good overview. Let's get stuck into our first one. So this is FIFA high commitment HR. Don't forget, when we talk high commitment HR, what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify best practice in HR more broadly, and we're looking at how we can bundle these based on situations, contingencies, and so on. And this is FIFA's high commitment HR. So he lists 7 different best practices. and we're going to ask some critical questions about this in a minute. But let's just go through these one at a time. So providing security to employees. So employment security, making sure that people want to stay, you have less turnover, and you have higher retention levels. Now, already by just thinking about that for a minute, you know that basically high commitment HR is leading to what's called organizational citizenship behavior, OCB. Now, what OCB is all about, and again, if you want to have a snoop, I've published on this, thinking about a private business college here in the UK. I was thinking about the academics, and we had a very high turnover, and unfortunately within a teaching driven institution, many of them didn't have any research backgrounds or research evidence, and therefore actually they were hampering themselves in terms of academic progression in the higher educational market. So I published a paper on this around these kinds of themes, and particularly around organizational citizenship behavior. Do Google my name and surname and you'll see my article pop up where I'm addressing this. Organizational citizenship behavior, in a nutshell, basically is employees who do their job, do their role, do their work beyond just doing it for the salary. They actually do more than their salary. There's a commitment to the organization, an excitement, a sense of achievement towards broader goals than just your own salary. Now, those kinds of things don't just happen. Some people, personality-wise, are the kinds of people who would do that just by nature. But how do you move an entire organization where the human resources has this kind of commitment, a high commitment, right? Which is why it's committed to organizational citizenship behavior. So as we go through these 7 areas, you will begin to notice just how these are linked to motivation. So job security, definitely tick. Next one. This selective hiring, so hiring the right people. So not just wanting to fill positions and we'll just take anybody as long as they kind of, meet the minimum requirements. No, being very specific about what you create in terms of an organizational culture. All the various employees together create a very particular kind of motivation within the organization, and so therefore selective hiring. And if you don't get the right person, you just don't hire. Self-managed and effective teams. So there's a high level of self-determined learning, self-directed learning. People take responsibility for their own professional development. Again, you can see how this links to the selective hiring, right? The right people who take their own career progressions and that of the company, and how this, this kind of a symbiotic relationship between what I want as an employee, but also, serving the organization in its best way possible. Fair and performance-based compensation. So if I do go over and above just doing the basics of my salary, besides just the motivational rewards, there are other rewards as well, recognition, etc., etc. Training in relevant skills. And again, this is about making sure that your human resources, your staff, are not just general in terms of their skills, but actually are beginning to become specialists within that particular area, which again is great in terms of recognition and so on. And creating a flat and egalitarian organization. So again, rather than focusing on status and particular people. But the problem when you have a very highly structured organization, and we've looked at structure in the past sessions, is that you tend to have people who end up in these positions in some ways by default relationship. They've been around long enough, but there's a lack of accountability that begins to creep into the organization. And people with high skills and high specialist roles, right, because you're doing selective hiring, they see this, and it becomes really annoying. When there's no transparency, when the performance is not fair, it begins to become, I'm thinking of the term when you kind of, your friends get promoted, your friends get the good treatment, nepotism. You begin to see a lot of nepotism taking place. Now, the article that I wrote, this private business college that I was working for, interestingly, there was rampant nepotism. So the college was in huge financial issues. They probably anticipated, negative downfall in terms of growth. There was a bit of a scandal that came out which was impacting all of this. But in the midst of this, people were being promoted into dean positions, left, right, and center. So where you should be peeling back, right, because a dean obviously gets paid a lot more, people were being promoted left, right, and center. There was a clear sense of nepotism that was going on, and the company closed very quickly because of mismanagement. So again, making sure that there's a flat, fair, egalitarian organization. And then finally, making information easily accessible to those who need it. And again, when you have a more of a hierarchical organization, this kind of information is not transparent and it's used as a form of power. So you can see how the high commitment HR model here by FIFA links to OCB behavior, OCB outcomes. Now, the question with this particular model is how do these best practices, and we've listed 7 here, contribute towards the company overall having competitive advantage. Yes, everybody's happy. Yes, there's a high level of OCB within the company, but how does this position the company competitively within its market? We'll leave that there as a question to consider. It's not a rhetorical question saying it doesn't. It does, but it needs to be more explicit in the way in which this is being used, right? Again, think about RBV, the way in which this is being combined, and how these different policies and practices are being combined to produce this. Again, the big question is how do we measure the increased productivity and the increased quality that will come out of OCB behavior? What are the measurements? And we'll come back to this in session, I think it's lecture 5. We're going to be looking at some of the measurements within human resource management, and we'll come back to this at a later stage as an overall theme. But it has been suggested that one of the ways in which this could be measured is the AMO model, abilities, motivation, and the organizational structure. So that is a nice link here back to the AMO model. Our next one is the Michigan model. Don't forget that it is suggested that this is more of a hard approach to HR. It is based on the rational strategy for formulation, and you can kind of see this in the model. So you're selecting particular people for very specific performance outcomes. Those are measured through an appraisal. If that performance is demonstrated, there are rewards. Where that performance lacks what it needs to be, that's moved through into training and development, which then again goes back into the loop in terms of measuring that performance. It's not necessarily what the person gets out, although there's rewards. It is more about what the company is trying to get out, which is why it's a more of a hard HR approach, particularly because of the measurements and the control factors that are taking place within it. But nonetheless, it was mentioned in our examples from session 6. This is the Michigan model. Moving on to the next one, which is a lot more complex and more interesting, particularly here in terms of our strategic models in action, is HR practices, which is based around the size, the history, the structure of the organization, and its engagement in relation to the size, history, and the structure of the market, and therefore how HR responds to that. So here's the life cycle model. A small company that's just started, you can see the vertical axis is all about the size of the company, and the time period is the horizontal one. Where a company is just starting and it's just beginning to grow, human resource management structures, policies, procedures is still in its infant stage. You're still working out how this works, setting this up properly, making sure your HR functions are operating efficiently and at a high level of quality. And then you begin to have growth. So in this growth phase, you will find a lot of control issues in terms of being able to make sure you retain good staff, they don't move on, but you're rewarding so that you can maintain that growth. But you will hit a stage where the size of the company has now increased to such a level and HR policies are now working, that you end up having this kind of plateau. There's a maturity stage. Now, again, here you're thinking about succession planning, all these different kinds of things. So different kinds of best practices come in at this point in time. And then when the company starts to decline, you're thinking now here about change management. So what do we need to do to have another cycle of growth? Or how do we manage the decline? And here again, you might have things like mergers, acquisitions, or you might just be declining, thinking about, I don't know. And again, Ansoff model comes in here. We looked at strategy in session 4, where you might be thinking about creating new products or services or going into new markets. So it's helpful to look at this life cycle model because, again, obviously, it creates different kinds of HR approaches depending on the size, the history, and the structure of the organization. And this allows us to kind of pinpoint exactly where we're at and what is required at those particular points. Our final one that we're looking at here is the configuration approaches. This is a slightly different take on the contingency theory. So what was helpful here is just to show you the comparison between the two. We start with the underlying assumptions, but then the contingency approach takes more of a reductionist way in which we're doing this, and again a reflection of most likely more likely a hard HR approach, whereas your configuration theory is looking more to a soft HR, a more holistic way in which you're bringing all of this together. In a nutshell, the configuration approaches is wanting to ensure a close fit between the internal HR policies and practices and the wider dimensions of what's going on in the company. It's what we're talking about here all along in terms of strategic human resource management. Again, let's not forget that as part of resource-based view, contingency theories, and again, the way in which the configuration of this happens, we are looking at competitive advantage. And the three key elements here in terms of competitive advantage and how strategic human resource management aligns with that is that it ends up becoming more firm-specific rather than general skills. So, you know, it's contextual, right? Contingency. It's more about the teams and therefore teams effectiveness, high-performing teams, than about individuals. And again, it's about the HR systems and how, again, bundling, right? The best practice, how these are all combined to its effectiveness rather than individually isolated HR practices as such. So again, the configuration approach in some ways is quite logical in the sense of how this fits in, but it's a model nonetheless on its own worth considering. So what does this all mean in terms of strategic human resource management in practice? Well, let's look at our case study of the motor industry in South Africa, and particularly in terms of Mercedes-Benz. So case study 3.1 tells us about South Africa, quite a unique situation because of the history of apartheid. We know that this was legalized racism where the white population was given a position of priority and all the other non-whites were being affected in terms of what they were allowed in terms of their legal rights, but as well as employment and so on. So what happened within this context in South Africa under apartheid was that you had knockdown kits of parts from abroad, and these were kind of put together in South Africa. So in essence, it was promoted in terms of an import substitution. So you find this in a lot of other countries where they produce similar versions of something which is a standard product, but they can't afford the standard product. So they kind of have this kind of knocked together kind of thing that looks similar, but it's not exactly the same thing. And of course, under apartheid with racial discrimination in the communities, this was mirrored by a kind of racial Fordism. So non-whites were largely condemned to poorly paid, unskilled work, and kind of the Taylorism, putting nuts on and a conveyor belt, very little motivation, so on and so on. But in the 1980s, you noticed a rise in lots of unions. The cheap labor, which had been relied on previously, was now becoming a threat, and new independent unions became increasingly visible and outspoken. And this led to massive strikes massive strike action. Factories were definitely rendered no-go areas for the management due to their own safety issues. But this all actually did lead to changes. And slowly but for surely, workers were able to press for higher pay rates. And this obviously, and this is what we've been discussing here in all of these models, this actually led to an increase in productivity and an increase to motivation. Workers became more motivated and firms had to therefore adjust. So again, your contingency models and so on, ways of managing their people better. Because they begin to reap the benefits. Now, one example of this was Mercedes. And again, here you can see the market share in December 2022 of Mercedes within South Africa. They had much better play and working conditions compared to all of the other manufacturers, and there were new opportunities for upskilling and career advancement within the companies, and a range of participative mechanisms, employee participation and involvement, giving workers a real say in the process of the production. And this, during those time periods, this led to Mercedes being one of the most sought after places to be employed because of the way in which they did this. Today, the plant is one of the most productive car plants in the world for Mercedes-Benz, even though it's only a 3.1 market share. It's an integral part of Mercedes-Benz worldwide production network. However, it's only a 3.1 market share, and there are some challenges that continue to remain, such as new low-cost suppliers, which is always a big challenge, particularly with China's involvement in Africa. And we know the issues around steel industries. And then, of course, there's also disruption in existing business models of Mercedes-Benz overall, and the challenge of what this means in South Africa in terms of the future of the plant. So again, it's a really interesting case study. Do go and have a look. Some reflective questions. What lessons does Mercedes-Benz in East London plant hold for human resource managers worldwide? What could you draw on from some of the models that we've just looked at? What lessons does this experience in South Africa hold for companies worldwide, particularly in markets where there are low wages? And what strategies, particularly thinking of some of these that we've just looked at, could mitigate or compensate for some of the challenges that we have mentioned here as well? So that's session 7. We're going to jump into session 8, where we're going to be looking at developing a strategic human resource management approach. So we've seen some of the action of these models. We're now going to be looking at how to develop these.